Well, good morning to you. I'm Rod Lofton out of the Space Station Research Planning Office, and we'll give you a briefing on the research planning process and what we go through to get investigations and payloads into a plan so that we can execute those on orbit. Next chart, please. I guess the goals of the presentation is really to give you an idea of what is needed or what we do as far as the collection, review, and integration of the research requirements and put them into a plan so that we can, again, have those things executed on orbit. The presentation I want to talk to you today gives a few areas of items of interest. One is where do we get the requirements, to whom those requirements are submitted to, how they're integrated into a requirements plan, and how we integrate that plan, how that plan is formulated into something that we can pass on to our mission integration team, who actually goes off and works with the ops team to execute the plan. So hopefully after this presentation, you have a better understanding of what we do from the research planning process perspective. Next chart. Basically, the process involves a series of steps we use to produce what we call this increment research plan, which identifies the payload requirements requested to be implemented during the particular increment. We use a team called the Multilateral Research Planning Working Group, or mrpwg, to actually formulate this plan and produce the requirements into a plan so that we can, again, hand it off to our integration folks to go off and help execute. I'll talk a little bit more about that team a little bit later. But the IRP consists of research investigations, resource requirement specifications, manifest items for the transport vehicles that we use, whether it's HTV or shuttle or ATV, or the progress vehicles, and also items that are needed to implement the requirements on orbit, like crew time, resources, power, data, that type of thing. As far as the basic flow and development of the IRP, you can see it here with this flow chart. There are 6 basic steps that we go through. One, and I'll go through each one of these a little bit later on in the charts, but to go through in a summary form, the first one is to we do release a call for inputs, essentially, and that's in the form of a data package being released that tells each of the what we call research planning offices or organizations who are tasked with presenting or developing these requirements. We release that data package to them, and again, I'll go through each of these steps later. The next step is for them to submit back to us a list of candidate payloads that they'd like to fly during the increment, whether it's the first increment or the first increment within the increments, and there's a 2-stage increment that we're actually doing. But they'll submit to us a list of candidate payloads that we would evaluate. Then the next step, step 3, is really for them to submit the detailed requirements in a form that we can use and put into a computer database so that we can sum up all the requirements that we have and make some judgments on those. Then we go through a process at the mrpwg where we go off and assess those requirements against the allocations that the program has given to us, and we make some judgments on and recommendations on whether or not a particular item can fly on a particular flight or needs to be moved to different flights to stay within the allocations that we have. The next step would be to actually formulate the requirements into a plan itself and present that plan to the mrpwg, by which we would get agreement from the community to go off and implement that plan, agreement on that plan so we can go off and implement it. Then we turn it over to, or present that plan to our management for them to approve. Again, the IRP is essentially a plan that we use, but it's used by our mission integration team, who actually produces what we call a PTP, or Payload Tactical Plan. You'll hear more about that a little bit later, I believe, in the next presentation, Norris's presentation. But I'm not going to focus on the PTP. I'll just focus on, in my presentation, just the development of the IRP. Let's go to the next chart, please. Okay, you saw a similar type chart of this one, which is kind of identifies the sources of the requirements that we get, largely from headquarters. I think Rod Jones and Mary Beth presented a chart, but it was more of in a pie chart format. I've kind of looked at that and made it a little bit more into a bubble chart. But basically, these are the various sponsors of the research that we want to do on ISS, whether it's from the national lab perspective or human research or the ERTD, or I'm sorry, ESMD directorate there at headquarters. So those groups work with, or they provide the requirements to the research planning organizations who interface with us here at the ISS program office through the mrpwg. And I'll talk a little bit more about the mrpwg, I guess, in a minute or so. So you'll see where we get the source of the requirements and how those are used. Next chart. And to talk about the mrpwg, this is basically it. We do have a chairman, and we're supported by a number of organizations, a lot of the international partner organizations for the USOS perspective, ESA, CSA, and JAXA. And we also have a position called the lead increment scientist, who is tasked with, he or she is tasked with being the focal point for coordinating all the research requirements for a particular increment and working with each of the IPs and the NASA organizations to develop the best research that we can accomplish on orbit. Each one of those organizations are supported by various teams. They could be PS teams or principal investigators or project scientist teams. They also work the details and supply that information to each of the IPs that are part of the RPWG. On the NASA side, we do have a NASA-only, essentially, RPWG, of which you can see the members that are listed there. I think the first 7 or so are organizations that we call essentially research planning organizations who work the details with the headquarters folks on what requirements we want to do for a particular increment. I won't read through all the responsibilities there, but I guess from my perspective, the bottom line is that we use again the mrpwg to develop the the increment research plans. Let's see. Let's move on to the next chart. You'll probably see this chart, I think you've seen it at least once already. You'll probably see it again a couple more times with the other folks coming in. But basically, this is the payload integration timeline, and it talks, and I want to tell you about where the IRP fits in. So can I have the next click, please? The IRP is developed over a 6-month period. It usually starts, well, we kind of back it up from the time period where we want to have the increment start. So over about an 18, I-18 or 6-month period, we develop the IRP. So it kind of fits in just before, a year or so before there's the increment start. Okay, next chart. A little bit more about the actual development process overview. You can see that the mrpwgs there is in the middle of what we do. Again, based on what I showed you on the steps, we do send out the call for a candidate list, and we do get back the specific resource definition, 2-pagers and things like that. And I'll talk to you a little bit more in a minute what those are. We get those inputs, requirements back through the RPWG. And can I get the next click? We do have other requirements coming in, allocations and things from the program that we must adhere to when we do put together the research plan. Um, Flight and increment-specific utilization allocations like up mass and amount of crew time that's available to us. So, and that's done over the increment. So we have to keep those in mind and adhere to those requirements as we do put together the plan. Next click. We also have need to take into account, obviously, the vehicle launch schedules and sequences, whether or not, which vehicle is coming first and how long it's going to be on orbit and what its capabilities are. And those are, again, the shuttles and the international partner launch vehicles. Next click. One of the other big things that we do adhere to is payload prioritization, which essentially means what the various agencies want to have as their, top priorities for accomplishing research during a particular increment. So we do get requirements from our program scientist office for ISS as well as the international partners and take those into account when we do formulate the IRP. Next chart, or next click, please. And finally, one of the other big things we do is look at feasibility, or do have a feasibility assessment conducted, usually by our integration folks, that looks on a payload by payload basis what the various things from a readiness standpoint that they would give to us just to let us know whether or not a particular investigation or payload is, it's ready to go and actually should be put into the research plan. Things like engineering, interface definition requirements. We look at safety information. We also look at ops products like nomenclature, things like that. But all that's fed into the mrpwg pulling together the IRP. Next chart. Okay, on a step-by-step basis, let's talk a little bit about each one of those. Step one, again, is the research plan development package release. And again, at the I-18 months time frame, the chairman of the mrpwg, myself, essentially sends out a call to the various research organizations that says that we are starting to formulate a increment research plan. And that development package consists of a number of items you can see there. I won't go through all of them, but we do have the planning schedule that we try to adhere to over the 6-month time period where various products need to be developed and delivered. Again, we talk the flight-specific schedules. We do have a template that we like for folks to adhere to as far as the candidate list, and that gives us a heads up of what may be coming for the particular increment. We do have a very important piece of information that we do request from the developers, which is a 2-pager, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, I guess, on the next page or so, which does give information on specifics, description of what the investigation is or payload is, and some of the basic ops that we need to look at. We also have a template or a website address, I guess, for the payload tactical plan or PTP development, and that is a web-based application that the developers would actually put in the details of the specific investigation or payload they want to fly. We also have a request for experiment summary. We use what we call a request form. It's really developed by our program scientist office, and we use that form to get more of the science information associated with the investigation, not necessarily looking at the hardware, but more of the science needs of that particular investigation and what it's looking to accomplish. And we do use that form to update the ISS science database, so it's an important piece of information that we try to collect. And I guess the last piece of information is if we're having, or if an investigation wants to use human subjects as far as their, as part of their investigation, we do have a milestone chart that says when the information needs to be submitted concerning baseline data collection, and increment reviews associated with the human subject. So those are the basic things that we have for step 1. I guess if we could move on to step 2. Talked about the two-pager, and here's an example of what a two-pager looks like. In this case, it was for a Canadian experiment called BUSY, or Bodies in Space Environment. We look for things like proposal numbers, science teams, who the principals are, research objectives, and operations, kind of in a summary one-page form here on page 1. And I would direct your attention to the table there on the lower right, which gives us a little bit more information on the specific investigation from a hardware standpoint, what facilities we like to use that are available on station, as well as things like late access requirements, and you can read the rest there. So it's a key piece of information that we use when we evaluate and formulate the IRP. Next page, please. We also have page 2 of this two-pager, which looks more into the operational scenario associated with the investigation we want to do. We also have sections for looking at training requirements and pre-flight and post-flight BDC, as well as the middle section. You can see there it talks about the operations of the investigation on orbit, how much crew time and it's going to require. We also have space for identifying to which modules that we be using. And we do have the Jackson module there too. It's just that this particular time, when this one was put together, we didn't have the Jackson module available. And you can also see there's blocks there for up mass and down mass associated with hardware that was needed for the investigation. So these two pages are, again, very important for us to evaluate and pull together a research plan. Okay, let's move on to the next chart. Step 2, this is, I won't go through the details. This is just the candidate list being submitted to us. Again, it identifies from the research planning organization perspective what the investigations are, what hardware they need, when they would like to fly it, on which particular vehicles. Next chart. Step 3, this is, again, the detailed requirements that we're requesting. Again, we will expect to get at this time the two-pagers that we will evaluate, and also the other information that we had requested as part of step 1. Let's see, let's move on to the next chart. Step 4, and here's where we start to look at the detailed assessment of the information that we got in. At about out of 17 months, we start reviewing the submitted two-pagers and the information that we get as part of the payload tactical plan, as part of the web-based information that's submitted. And the basic goal here is for the teams to get a, kind of a detailed, in-depth understanding of what the requirements are, and look at those across the board with all the requirements that we receive from each of the organizations. We do look at, again, the comparison of the payload requirements against the resource allocation that the program has stipulated to us, principally looking again at the up mass, down mass, crew time, and things like that. Okay, let's move on to the next chart. Okay, once we've done all that, the chairman will put together a presentation essentially that sums up the entire discussions that we've had and the puts and takes that we've had associated with the review of the data that we have for the development of the IRP. We'll put together that probably around I-12 or a little bit before then, and take that and have reviews amongst the the various mrpwg community and pull together the final product that we will take forward to the Payloads control board, as well as the multilateral Payloads control board for approval. And again, that data is used to help formulate the PTP, or Payload Tactical Plan, that you'll have a little bit more discussion about a little bit later. Okay, let's move on. I just want to show you some of the elements of the research plan. We do have an investigation list from each of the organizations or agencies, and also we'll show a distribution of kind of where that research falls, depending on what it is, whether it's education or life sciences and things like that. Next chart. One of the things important things we do that I mentioned is that we do compare the requirements that we have for the research plan that the researchers want us to do versus the allocations that is given to us by the program. And we'll show a typical graph like this that shows where we are, requirements versus allocation, depending on which flight vehicle we have. And some cases we may be over the allocation, some cases we may be under the allocation. We will try to, in most cases, switch things around to use the best vehicle fit to stay within the allocation. But in cases where we are over the allocation, but there is a substantial need or a real need for us to use that particular vehicle, we'll identify that to the program and ask for more allocation on those particular vehicles. And the program, in the most part, has been very good about giving us that when we've needed it. Next chart. One of the other things we do show is kind of a typical list of the hardware that was being manifested. And in this particular chart, I just showed you where they kind of fall for, this was increments 27 and 28, where they kind of fall in those particular increments. And clearly everything doesn't go on a particular vehicle. They're spread over the vehicles, but as part of the research plan, we will show the amount of hardware that we have and where it goes up, and as well as return. Next chart. Crew time is a premium. It has been in the past for operating the investigations, so we do keep track of what our allocation is and what the requirements are. So we'll show a typical table like this that shows our planning requirements for the prime crew time, which is the ones that we believe are the ones that must be done in order for us to have a successful increment, as well as we also keep a healthy reserve of crew time or investigations that can be done if more crew time is available. So we'll show this to the program and try to, again, stay within the allocation that we're given, but with the knowledge that we do have reserve activities in case crew time does become available. And we do break it down by partner. Let's see, I think I have, next chart, just one more chart, which is kind of summing things up. Well, basically, I won't read through the charts, but just gave you a indication of what we do from a planning perspective of putting together an IRP and how that is formulated and is used for identifying the research and that we need for particular increments. Let's see, that's really all I had. Let's see, are there any questions or comments that folks may have?
It looked like you had, did you have any questions for this?
We want to go to the mic.
Please come to the mic. I'll beat you to it. I just have one question. How do we integrate with the Russian partners? Thank you, that's my question.
Scott, from what perspective? From hardware going up, or crew time on orbit, or everything?
Yeah, I assume that there's Russian cosmonauts will do some of our experiments and vice versa. Does that come to your board, or is that some other?
Well, what we've typically, if we do need to use a Russian partner, yeah, it would come to this board, and we'll work that through our mission integration team, OC, to actually work with the Russians to get that approved. For hardware that's going up on the vehicles, there's no issue there. We'll, you know, again, we're given an allocation from the Russians, or NASA's given an allocation from the Russians for us to fly hardware on, so we'll work that again through our mission integration team. Is there another question? Okay, well, thank you very much.